Margaret Wilson had always believed that a home carried memory. Walls remembered laughter. Floors remembered footsteps. And doors, especially doors, remembered who was once welcomed and who was later tolerated. That was how she knew something had changed. The house in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, no longer felt like hers. It wasn't just the furniture, though most of it had been replaced. The oak dining table her husband refinished with his own hands was gone, swapped for something modern and cold. The family photos that once lined the staircase had slowly vanished, replaced by abstract art Margaret didn't understand and didn't ask about. No, the change lived in the air. The way voices lowered when she entered a room. The way conversation stopped. The way her presence became inconvenient. Margaret sat at the dining table that morning with her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her posture was straight, disciplined by decades of habit. She wore a pale blue cardigan, buttoned all the way up despite the warmth of the kitchen. Her gray hair was pinned back, tidy and unremarkable. Across from her, her daughter-in-law, Emily Wilson, scrolled through her phone, long acrylic nails tapping sharply against the screen. The sound was impatient. Irritated. As if even the act of sitting in the same room with Margaret demanded compensation. To Emily's right sat Daniel, Margaret's son. He stared into his coffee mug. Margaret's plate was empty. Not because there wasn't food. The smell of scrambled eggs, toast, and fried bacon filled the room. Emily's plate was full. Daniel's too. The serving dishes sat between them, close enough to reach with ease. But no one offered. Margaret waited. She did not ask. She never asked anymore. After a few minutes, Emily glanced up, feigning surprise. "Oh," she said lightly. "I didn't realize you wanted breakfast. You usually don't eat much." Margaret nodded once. That was all. Emily shrugged and went back to her phone. Daniel shifted in his chair but said nothing. Silence had become their language. Margaret Wilson was 72 years old. For most of her life, silence had never been her weakness. She had worked 31 years as a senior legal advisor for a federal investigative agency, specializing in internal compliance and domestic abuse cases that never made headlines. She knew how violence hid behind polite smiles and family matters. She knew how long it took before someone finally spoke. She also knew that silence could be strategic. But this silence? This was not strategy. This was survival. After breakfast, if it could be called that, Margaret stood carefully, steadying herself on the edge of the table. Her joints ached faintly, a reminder of time rather than illness. Emily sighed loudly. "Daniel," she said, not bothering to lower her voice, "every movement is such a production. It's exhausting." Daniel finally looked up. "Mom," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes, "just, be careful." Margaret gave him a small nod. She turned and walked down the hallway toward the guest bedroom. The guest bedroom. Once, it had been her study. That room had held bookshelves filled with case law, binders labeled with careful handwriting, and a heavy wooden desk where she once reviewed federal reports late into the night. That desk was gone now, replaced by a treadmill Emily used exactly twice before it became a clothes rack. Margaret sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself one slow breath. She did not cry. Crying was for people who still expected kindness. 6 months earlier, Margaret Wilson had still believed in her son. After her husband, Thomas, passed away from a sudden heart attack, the house became unbearably quiet. Daniel insisted she move in with him and Emily. "You shouldn't be alone, Mom," he said gently. Emily smiled and added, "We'll take care of you." Margaret sold her smaller condo and moved in. At first, things were fine. Emily cooked. Daniel checked in on her. They called her Mom instead of Margaret. The change was gradual. Her mail began arriving already opened. "Oh, I thought it was ours," Emily said casually. Her phone would go missing for hours. "You probably misplaced it," Emily said. Doctor appointments were rescheduled without asking. "We thought this time worked better," Daniel said. Margaret noticed everything. She said nothing. The first time Emily raised her voice, it was over something trivial. A bank statement. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter, reading it carefully. "There's a withdrawal here I don't recognize," she said calmly. Emily froze. Her smile vanished. "You don't need to worry about finances anymore," Emily snapped. "Daniel handles that now." Margaret looked up. "I've handled my finances my entire life." Emily stepped closer. "You're not in charge anymore." Daniel stood in the doorway. He said nothing. That night, Margaret locked her bedroom door for the first time. The night her arm broke, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Margaret woke needing the bathroom. She moved slowly down the hallway, careful not to make noise. She didn't want to disturb anyone. She had learned that her needs were inconvenient. She had just passed the living room when she felt it. A shove. Hard, from behind. Instinct took over. She raised her arm to protect her head. Crack. The sound was sharp and unmistakable. Pain exploded up her arm, white-hot and blinding. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her back hitting the hardwood with a dull thud. She gasped. Tried to speak. From the living room, Emily's voice floated over, casual and annoyed. "Oh my God. Margaret? Did you fall?" Margaret couldn't answer. Emily crouched beside her, not to help, but to lean in close. Her voice dropped. "Don't scream," Emily whispered. "Don't make this worse for yourself." Daniel appeared seconds later. He looked at his mother on the floor. Then at his wife. Emily spoke first. "She tripped. I told her to be careful." Daniel swallowed. "Mom," he said quietly, "why don't you just rest?" Margaret was taken to the hospital. No police report. No questions. Just a cast. The orthopedic doctor studied the X-ray longer than necessary. "This fracture," he said carefully, "is unusual." Margaret met his eyes. "How so?" He hesitated. Then lowered his voice. "This isn't consistent with a simple fall. It's a defensive fracture." Margaret nodded once. She already knew. Back in the present, Margaret sat alone in the guest bedroom, staring at the cast on her arm. It ached. But pain had done something important. It had clarified the truth. Silence was no longer protection. It was permission. Margaret reached under the mattress and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. Inside were dates, times, short notes written in precise handwriting. She picked up her pen, and for the first time in months, Margaret Wilson began to prepare. Not for survival. For truth. The cast itched. It was a dull, maddening itch beneath layers of plaster, the kind that could not be scratched and would not be ignored. Margaret Wilson sat in the guest bedroom, her right arm resting awkwardly on a pillow, her finger swollen and bruised where the cast ended. Pain had become her constant companion. Not sharp pain anymore, no, that had passed, but a deep, aching reminder that something inside her had been broken on purpose. Downstairs, she could hear Emily moving around the kitchen. Cabinets slammed. A chair scraped loudly across the floor. Every sound was exaggerated, performative, meant to announce irritation. Margaret closed her eyes. She had spent decades teaching young investigators that abuse did not always announce itself with screams. Sometimes it arrived quietly, wearing the voice of inconvenience. She's difficult. She's old. She's confused. Emily had learned that language quickly. The return from the hospital. The day Margaret returned from the hospital, Emily had been unusually pleasant. Too pleasant. She helped Margaret into the car, her hand firm on Margaret's uninjured arm, her nails digging in just enough to remind her who was in control. "Doctors worry too much," Emily said cheerfully as they drove home. "You'll be fine in no time." Daniel drove in silence, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. At home, Emily insisted on arranging everything. I'll handle her meds, she said quickly, plucking the prescription bag from Daniel's hand. It's easier if one person manages it. Margaret noticed. She always noticed. That night, when the pain flared and sleep refused to come, Margaret rang the small bell the nurse had suggested, an old habit from caregiving years ago. Emily appeared in the doorway, arms crossed. What is it now? She asked. My medication, Margaret said calmly. The hospital said. Emily sighed. You already had it. Margaret knew she hadn't. But she nodded. Silence again. Isolation. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret's world shrank. Emily cancelled her follow-up appointment. They said it wasn't necessary, she lied easily. Friends who tried to call were told Margaret was resting. She gets confused if she talks too much, Emily said. Margaret's phone disappeared entirely one afternoon. You don't need it, Emily said. You barely use it. Daniel avoided her eyes. Margaret watched him carefully. She had raised him alone after Thomas worked double shifts. She knew his tells, the slight tightening of his jaw. The way his shoulders slumped when he chose the easier path. Daniel was not cruel. He was weak. And weakness, Margaret knew, was often more dangerous than cruelty. The follow-up that changed everything. Margaret waited. 3 weeks after the injury, when the pain became impossible to ignore and her fingers began to swell unnaturally, she made her move. Emily was at work. Daniel had left early. Margaret took her coat, slipped on her shoes with difficulty, and walked, slowly, carefully, out the front door. She took a cab. The orthopedic clinic was quiet that afternoon. The same doctor recognized her immediately. You weren't scheduled, he said gently, concern flickering across his face. I wasn't allowed, Margaret replied. He didn't ask who had stopped her. He led her into an exam room and carefully examined the cast. This should have been adjusted, he said. Your follow-up was missed. Margaret met his eyes. My daughter-in-law cancelled it. The doctor exhaled slowly. He removed the cast for inspection and ordered new imaging. When the X-ray appeared on the screen, he stared at it for a long moment. Then longer. Margaret waited. Finally, he turned to her. Mrs. Wilson, he said carefully, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. She nodded. Did someone push you? Margaret did not hesitate. Yes. The doctor leaned back, his expression grave. This fracture is textbook, he said. Midshaft radial fracture. Defensive. You raised your arm to protect your head. He paused. I see this in assault cases. Margaret felt something settle inside her. Confirmation. Truth. He printed copies of the images and handed them to her. You may want these, he said quietly, and you may want to speak to someone. Margaret took the envelope. I already am, she said. Emily tightens control. When Emily came home that evening, she knew immediately something was wrong. Margaret sat in the living room, the envelope of X-rays on the table beside her. Emily's eyes narrowed. Where did you go today? She asked. Doctor confirmed defensive fracture. X-rays obtained. Emily attempted to confiscate records. She wrote slowly, deliberately. Facts only. No emotion. Emotion was for courtrooms when facts were secure. She hid the notebook deeper under the mattress. Then she did something she hadn't done in months. She smiled. Emily crosses a line. 2 days later, Margaret returned from the bathroom to find her room ransacked. Drawers open. Closet disturbed. Mattress lifted. Emily stood in the doorway. I was cleaning, she said. Margaret looked at her calmly. Don't touch my things again. Emily's face flushed red. You don't make rules here, she hissed. This is my house. Margaret stepped closer. Actually, she said quietly, it isn't. Emily laughed. You think you still have control? You don't even know what day it is half the time. Margaret's voice was steady. I know exactly what day it is. Emily stormed out. That night, Margaret slept with her shoes on. Just in case. The first call. At 2:17 a.m. when the house was silent and Emily's snores echoed faintly down the hall, Margaret reached into her coat pocket. Her old phone. She had hidden it weeks earlier. Her fingers trembled as she dialed a number she hadn't used in years. It rang once. Twice. A familiar voice answered. Margaret, the man said, surprised. Yes, she replied. I need to open a file. There was a pause. Then, quietly, I was hoping you'd call. Margaret closed her eyes. The silence was over. The voice on the other end of the phone was steady, familiar, and, most importantly, unafraid. Margaret, the man said again, this time softer. Are you safe right now? Margaret sat on the edge of the guest bed, her coat still on, her shoes still laced. The house was quiet in the way only sleeping houses were, false peace layered over tension. I am, she replied. For the moment. There was a pause. That's not the answer I was hoping for, he said. Margaret allowed herself a faint, humorless smile. It rarely is. The man's name was Robert Hale. Once, long ago, he had been a junior attorney under Margaret's supervision at the federal agency. She had taught him how to read between lines, how to see abuse where others saw inconvenience, how to document truth without embellishment. Now, he worked in internal oversight. And he remembered her. Tell me everything, Robert said. Start from the beginning. Not the emotions. The facts. Margaret inhaled slowly. And began. Facts, not feelings. She told him about the opened mail. The cancelled appointments. The missing phone. The shove. The broken arm. She described the doctor's words precisely. Defensive fracture. Consistent with assault. She did not cry. She did not dramatize. When she finished, there was silence on the line. Then Robert exhaled. This meets the threshold, he said. Elder abuse. Coercive control. Medical neglect. Margaret closed her eyes. Good, she said. Robert hesitated. Margaret, filing this will change things. I know. You live with them. I know. And your son, Margaret cut him off gently. My son has already chosen. Another pause. All right, Robert said finally. I'll start the process. But you need to protect yourself. I am, Margaret replied. She ended the call and carefully returned the phone to its hiding place. The file was open. There was no turning back. Daniel notices the shift. Daniel sensed it before Emily did. Something about his mother had changed. She moved with quiet purpose now. Her silence felt heavier. Intentional. When she spoke, it was measured, deliberate, as if every word had been weighed and approved before leaving her mouth. At breakfast, she sat straighter. When Emily snapped at her, Margaret did not flinch. When Daniel avoided her gaze, she did not look away first. It unsettled him. That evening, he found her in the living room, the television off, the room dim. Mom, he said awkwardly. You okay? Margaret looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. Are you? Daniel frowned. Why wouldn't I be? Margaret tilted her head slightly. You tell me. The silence stretched. I don't like what you're implying, Daniel said. I haven't implied anything, Margaret replied calmly. I asked a question. Daniel stood. Emily thinks you're confused lately, he said. Maybe we should talk about options. Margaret's expression did not change. What kind of options? A facility, he said quickly. Just until you're better. There it was. The word she'd been waiting for. Margaret nodded slowly. That would require a medical evaluation, she said. Daniel hesitated. Yes. By a doctor of my choosing, Margaret added. Daniel swallowed. We'll see, he said. Margaret smiled faintly. No, she replied. You'll see. Emily escalates. Emily didn't bother pretending anymore. The mask had slipped. She began speaking to Margaret as if she were a child. You can't leave the house alone. You'll hurt yourself. You forget things. Margaret corrected her once. I do not forget, she said. I document. Emily slammed a cabinet. You think writing things down makes you smart? Margaret met her gaze. No, she said quietly. It makes me accurate. That night, Emily locked the front door and hid the spare key. Margaret noticed. She added it to the notebook. The social worker. The knock came 3 days later. Firm. Professional. Emily opened the door, already irritated. Yes? My name is Karen Lopez, the woman said, holding up an ID. Adult Protective Services. I'm here to check on Margaret Wilson. Emily's smile froze. That's unnecessary, she said. She's resting. I'll need to see her, Karen replied. Emily turned sharply. Daniel. Margaret appeared behind them. I'm here, she said. Karen's eyes flicked immediately to the cast, the posture, the tension in the room. Mrs. Wilson, Karen said gently. May I speak with you privately? Emily opened her mouth. Margaret spoke first. Yes, she said. I would like that. Daniel shifted uncomfortably as Margaret followed Karen into the guest room. Karen closed the door. Are you being hurt? She asked quietly. Margaret did not hesitate. Yes. Karen nodded once. All right, she said. Then we proceed. Daniel's choice. That night, Daniel confronted his wife. This is getting serious, he said. APS? Investigations? This can ruin us. Emily laughed bitterly. She's lying. Daniel rubbed his face. She has X-rays. Emily's eyes flashed. Then we make her disappear, she snapped. Facility. Court order. She won't be believed. Daniel looked at her. Really looked. And for a moment, doubt flickered. Then he sighed. Do what you have to do, he said. Margaret heard every word from the hallway. She stood perfectly still. The last thread snapped. Preparation. That night, Margaret packed a small bag. Documents. The notebook. The X-rays. Her old phone. She placed it by the door. She slept fully dressed. For the first time since moving in, she was not afraid. She was ready. The order came on a Thursday morning. Margaret knew it before anyone said a word. She was sitting in the living room, her packed bag resting quietly beside the armchair, when she heard Emily's voice sharpen, tight, controlled, rehearsed. They're here. Daniel stood near the front door, pale, hands shoved into his pockets like a boy caught doing something he couldn't undo. 2 people stepped inside. A woman in a navy blazer holding a clipboard. A man in plain clothes with a calm, unreadable expression. The woman smiled politely. Mrs. Margaret Wilson? Margaret stood. Yes. I'm Dr. Elaine Foster, court-appointed psychiatrist. This is Officer Grant. We're here to conduct an emergency evaluation. Emily exhaled loudly, as if relieved. It's for her own good, she said quickly. She's been confused. Aggressive. Making accusations. Margaret looked at Daniel. He didn't look back. Dr. Foster gestured toward the couch. Mrs. Wilson, if you'll sit, we'll ask a few questions. Margaret did not sit. I will cooperate, she said calmly, after you review my medical records and speak to Adult Protective Services caseworker Karen Lopez. Dr. Foster paused. Emily stiffened. That's not necessary. It is, Margaret interrupted, her voice steady. And I have documentation. She reached into her bag and handed over the envelope. X-rays. Medical notes. Dates. Times. Dr. Foster's expression changed as she flipped through them. These are extensive, she said carefully. Officer Grant shifted his weight. Emily laughed nervously. She manipulates paperwork. That's what she does. Margaret turned to Dr. Foster. May I ask you a question, she said. Dr. Foster nodded. Have you reviewed the imaging that confirms a defensive fracture consistent with assault? Dr. Foster looked back down at the documents. Yes, she said quietly. Emily's smile cracked. Truth under examination. The evaluation lasted nearly an hour. Margaret answered every question calmly. What day is it? Who is the president? Where are you? She answered without hesitation. Dr. Foster asked about the fall. Margaret corrected her. It was not a fall, she said. It was a shove. Emily interrupted. She's lying. Dr. Foster raised a hand. Mrs. Wilson, please don't interfere. Emily fell silent. For the first time. Dr. Foster closed her folder and stood. Mrs. Wilson is fully oriented, she said. There is no medical justification for involuntary commitment. Emily's face flushed red. Daniel spoke up. But she's not safe alone. Dr. Foster turned to him. She's not safe here, she said. Officer Grant nodded slowly. Ma'am, he said to Margaret, would you like assistance leaving this residence? Margaret picked up her bag. Yes, she said. I would. Emily stared. You can't just take her, she snapped. Officer Grant met her gaze. Actually, he said calmly, we can. The house lets her go. As Margaret walked toward the door, she paused. She turned back. Daniel, she said softly. He looked at her then. Finally. You had every chance, she said. You chose comfort over truth. Daniel's eyes filled. Margaret did not stay to watch. The door closed behind her. And for the first time in months, the house was no longer holding her breath. Safe, but not finished. Margaret stayed that night in a small, quiet apartment arranged by APS. The walls were bare. The furniture was minimal. It felt like freedom. Karen Lopez sat across from her, notebook open. The investigation is now formal, Karen said. Your daughter-in-law will be charged. Your son may be named for neglect. Margaret nodded. I want to proceed, she said. Karen studied her. You're sure? Margaret's voice was calm. I didn't survive this to stop now. The call that changed everything. Later that night, Margaret received a call. Robert Hale. The file is active, he said. Federal oversight is involved. Emily's financial records raised red flags. Margaret closed her eyes. Good, she said. Margaret, Robert added, this will go to court. Yes, she replied. That's where truth belongs. She hung up and sat quietly. Tomorrow, the story would no longer belong to the house. The courtroom was colder than Margaret Wilson expected. Not physically, though the air conditioning hummed softly, but emotionally. Everything was muted here. Colors dulled. Voices restrained. Even anger seemed to lower its volume out of respect for the law. Margaret sat at the witness table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. The cast was gone now, replaced by a faint stiffness in her wrist that would likely remain for the rest of her life. A reminder. Not of weakness, but of survival. Across the room, Emily Wilson sat beside her attorney. She looked smaller than Margaret remembered. Her hair was pulled back tightly. Her expression was controlled, practiced, almost bored. But her eyes betrayed her, darting constantly, searching for reassurance that never came. Behind Emily sat Daniel. Alone. Margaret did not look at him. She had already said everything that needed saying. The case against Silence. The prosecution did not rush. They didn't need to. They began with medical evidence. The orthopedic surgeon testified first. The fracture was consistent with defensive injury, he said clearly. Not accidental. Not caused by a simple fall. The X-rays appeared on the screen. Black and white truth. Next came Karen Lopez from Adult Protective Services. She was isolated, Karen testified. Her appointments were cancelled. Her phone confiscated. Her movement restricted. Then came the financial analyst. Unauthorized withdrawals. Accounts rerouted. Margaret's savings slowly drained under the guise of family management. Emily's attorney objected twice. Both objections were overruled. Facts have a way of doing that. Daniel takes the stand. Daniel Wilson looked older than his 45 years as he raised his hand and swore to tell the truth. His voice shook when he spoke. I never hurt my mother, he said quickly. I didn't know what Emily was doing. The prosecutor tilted her head slightly. Mr. Wilson, she asked calmly, were you present the night your mother's arm was broken? Yes. Did you see her on the floor? Yes. Did you call the police? Daniel hesitated. No. Did you ask how the injury occurred? No. Did you prevent your wife from controlling her medication and appointments? Daniel swallowed. No. The courtroom was silent. The prosecutor nodded. No further questions. Daniel stepped down, avoiding Margaret's gaze. Emily's mask shatters. Emily took the stand next. She smiled at the jury. That smile didn't last long. The financial evidence crushed her composure. So you controlled Mrs. Wilson's bank accounts without legal authority? The prosecutor asked. I was helping her, Emily snapped. And the cancelled medical appointments? She didn't need them. And the attempt to have her involuntarily committed? Emily stood suddenly. She's lying, she shouted. She's ruining my life. The judge's gavel struck hard. Sit down, the judge ordered. One more outburst and you will be removed. Emily collapsed back into her chair, shaking. For the first time, she looked afraid. Margaret speaks. When Margaret was called, she walked to the stand unassisted. She did not carry notes. She did not raise her voice. She spoke once. I was silent because I was afraid, she said calmly. Then I was silent because I was documenting. She turned slightly toward the jury. Silence is often mistaken for consent. It is not. She looked toward the judge. I did not want revenge, she said. I wanted safety. And truth. That was all. The verdict. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, no one looked surprised. Guilty. Elder abuse. Assault. Financial exploitation. Emily wept. Daniel stared at the floor. The judge spoke slowly. Mrs. Wilson, he said to Margaret, your courage prevented further harm. This court recognizes the gravity of what you endured. Emily was sentenced. Daniel lost guardianship rights permanently. The gavel fell. After. Margaret moved into a small apartment overlooking a park. She furnished it simply. A table by the window. A chair that faced the sun. A bookshelf, new, but filling quickly. On her first morning there, she made herself breakfast. She served herself. She ate in silence. But it was a different kind of silence now. It was peaceful. Margaret Wilson had not raised her voice. She had raised the truth. And the truth had answered.